who was the actual man at the heart of the world's largest religion. I mean, not the divine figure, but the person of flesh and blood. Today, we're going to peel back 2,000 years of theology to go searching for the historical man Yeshua ben Joseph, Jesus, son of Joseph. Okay, let's dive right in.
So, before we can go any further, we have to tackle the biggest question of all. If you put the Bible aside, is there any actual proof that Jesus of Nazareth was a real, living, breathing person? Now, for centuries, this was a huge debate, but today, the overwhelming consensus among historians, and I mean even those who aren't religious at all, is yes. The real challenge isn't proving he existed, it's trying to separate the historical man from the divine myth that grew around him.
So, to find him, the first place we have to look is actually outside the Christian tradition. Historians rely on accounts from people who were writing around the same time, but who were not his followers. You know, these non-Christian sources are absolutely crucial because they can verify his life and, maybe even more importantly, his death.
Okay, take a look at this. What's so amazing about this quote isn't just what it says, but who said it. This isn't from a follower, it's from Tacitus, one of ancient Rome's most famous and respected historians. He's writing about this huge fire in Rome and just casually mentions this group called Christians. And in one sentence, he confirms that their name came from a guy named Christ, that this person was executed, and he even names the officials involved, Emperor Tiberius and the governor, Pontius Pilate. For a historian, this is pure gold, a totally independent snapshot from someone with zero Christian agenda.
All right, let's move on to our next key witness, a first-century Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus. In his giant work, Antiquities of the Jews, he writes this little passage about Jesus. He calls him a wise man, a teacher, someone who got a lot of people to follow him, and again, he independently confirms that Pilate condemned him to the cross. But there's a little bit of a catch with this particular text.
And this brings us to a really important point about ancient history. You have to remember, we're dealing with documents that were copied by hand, over and over, for centuries. So in this case, most scholars agree that somewhere along the line, later Christian scribes, wanting to beef up the story, added in phrases like, he was the Messiah. But here's the thing, even when you strip away those later additions, the core of it is still there. Josephus, a non-Christian, is confirming that a man named Jesus existed and was executed by Pilate.
And this is just so cool. This is where archaeology steps in to back up the written texts. For the longest time, Pontius Pilate was a guy we really only knew about from the Gospels. And then, in 1961, archaeologists found this limestone block. It's part of a building dedication to the Emperor Tiberius, and carved right into it is the name Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. I mean, come on, it's actual physical proof that a major character in the Jesus story was a real person, in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. Okay, so we pretty much established he existed through outside sources. So now, let's turn to the most famous sources of all, the Gospels. But for what we're doing here, we're not going to treat them like sacred scripture. We're going to put on our historian hats and read them as historical documents, as collections of stories and sayings that were put together decades after the events happened.
It's really important to get what the Gospels are and what they aren't. They're not eyewitness journalism, written down on the spot. They were actually composed decades after Jesus' death. The authors were basically collecting stories that had been passed down by word of mouth. They even borrow from each other, which is why you see some stories that are almost identical, and other times they completely contradict each other. But for historians, they are incredibly valuable, because if you look closely, underneath all the theology, they've preserved this raw portrait of a very, very human figure.
And this is where you can find the man of flesh and blood. The Gospels show us a Jesus who gets furious and starts flipping over tables in a temple, a man who openly weeps, just breaks down, at the death of his friend Lazarus. They mention he had brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and sisters too. And in his last moments, they record this cry of just complete despair. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's a portrait of humanity, not just divinity.
Now, let's look at how the story itself builds, because a lot of the traditions that we just take for granted as being part of the original story, well, they were actually added centuries later. The story of Jesus evolved big time, and it absorbed all kinds of influences from the cultures around it.
Okay, let's start with his birthday. Christmas, December 25th, right? Well, where did that date even come from? The Bible never gives a date for his birth. It turns out December 25th was already a massive holiday in the Roman Empire. It was the festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, celebrating the days getting longer after the winter solstice. The early church basically pulled off a brilliant marketing move. piggybacking on this super popular pagan festival and reframing it as the birth of the Son of Righteousness.
And how about where he was born? I mean, his family was from Nazareth. The whole story about them traveling to Bethlehem for a Roman census, it doesn't really add up, historically speaking. So what's a more likely explanation? Well, there was an old prophecy in the Hebrew scriptures that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, the city of King David. So it seems pretty likely that the gospel writers added that detail to make it clear that Jesus was fulfilling that prophecy.
Think about Christianity for a second. What's the first symbol that pops into your head? The cross, right? It's everywhere. But what if I told you that for the first few hundred years, Christians would have never used it? I mean, think about it. The cross was a symbol of a horrible, shameful public execution. It's not exactly something you'd want as your brand logo. So instead, the early Christians used secret symbols, like the fish, which was an acronym in Greek, or the anchor, a symbol of hope. The cross only became the main symbol much later, after the Roman Empire had adopted Christianity.
So what did he actually look like? Well, the honest-to-goodness answer is we have absolutely no idea. The popular image we all have in our heads, the long hair, the beard, the European features, that's a complete artistic invention. The very first images we have of him, from around the 4th century, show a clean-shaven guy who looks more like a Roman philosopher. The bearded image we know today was actually inspired by classical statues of gods like Jupiter or Zeus, because that's how you depicted wisdom and authority back then. This all brings us to the end of his life. And to really understand the historical Jesus, you have to understand how and why he died. When you look at the evidence, it all points not to some religious argument, but to a political execution carried out by the Roman state. So who was really responsible for his death? The Gospels actually tell us what the charges were, and they're all political, stirring up the nation, telling people not to pay their taxes, claiming to be a king. Now, under Roman law, the Jewish high court, the Sanhedrin, simply did not have the power to execute someone. And crucifixion, that wasn't a Jewish punishment. That was Rome's brutal signature method for putting down rebels and traitors. So the historical conclusion is pretty clear. Jesus was executed by Pontius Pilate for the Roman state, for the crime of sedition. So what would have happened to the body? It's pretty grim, but for a criminal executed by the state, you don't get a nice family burial. Standard Roman procedure was pretty clear. An official would have taken charge of the body. It would have been placed in a temporary tomb set aside for executed criminals. And then, once those tombs were full, they'd be emptied out into a common unmarked grave.
And understanding that procedure is so important because it might just explain how the resurrection story got started. Now, belief in the soul surviving after death was a common idea back then. So just imagine his followers going back to the tomb to pay their respects, and they find it empty. Not because of a miracle, but because, as was standard practice, the body had been moved to that common grave. You can see how that discovery of an empty tomb could have powerfully fueled the belief that he had been resurrected. It's also really telling that the earliest accounts seem to talk about a spiritual resurrection. The stories of a physical body coming back to life, those don't show up until decades later.
So after you lay all the evidence out, what are we left with? Well, it's almost like we have two distinct figures, the man who actually lived and the Christ of faith. And it's really important to separate what history can verify from what is purely a matter of belief. Here's what history gives us, the cold, hard facts. A first-century Jewish man from Nazareth named Yeshua. He was a preacher whose movement was seen as a political threat by Rome. He was arrested, he was charged with treason, and he was executed by crucifixion under the orders of Pontius Pilate. Those are the facts that are backed up by the historical and the archaeological record. So in the end, you really have two figures. You have the historical record, which gives us this compelling flesh-and-blood man whose life and death kicked off a global movement. And then you have the Christ of faith, the resurrected Son of God, the Messiah. That's a powerful theological story built on top of that historical foundation. History can't prove or disprove that story. It's simply beyond its reach. It belongs to the realm of faith.
And that leaves us with one final question to think about. For anyone, believer or not, does separating the historical man from the religious icon, does understanding how the story was built, piece by piece over centuries, does that diminish its meaning? Or does it maybe make the story of this one man from Nazareth even more remarkable?